Aristocracy, she had decided, was nothing more than well-dressed bankruptcy. Annalise Thorne understood the language of numbers far better than the coded whispers of the ballroom. A ledger book was an honest thing, it told a story of profit or loss with an elegant, brutal simplicity. There was no subtext in a column of figures, no need to decipher a smirk or a pointedly turned shoulder. Here, however, in the glittering crush of the Marquis of Pembroke's annual gala, every glance was a transaction, every pleasantry a carefully weighed asset. She felt the weight of her own social ledger, a book drenched in red ink. The daughter of a merchant, albeit a prodigiously successful one, she was an item of questionable value. Her father's death 2 years prior had left her with a fortune, a head for business that was considered most unladylike, and a social standing as precarious as a house built on sand. The fortune was the only reason she was here at all, a gilded lure for titled men with crumbling estates. Her recent engagement to Lord Everton, a man with a charming smile and debts like an anchor, had been a calculated investment in security. An investment that had soured spectacularly when he jilted her for Lady Beatrice Croft, a woman with a pedigree as long and unblemished as her own was short and suspect. The public humiliation had been a sharp, clean wound. Annalise, ever the pragmatist, had assessed the damage, tallied her losses, and resolved to cut them. Sorrow was a luxury she could not afford. Tonight, she wore her resilience like armor. Her gown, a deep sapphire silk that had cost a sensible sum, was elegant but not ostentatious. She moved through the throng with a quiet dignity that was often mistaken for shyness. It was not. It was observation. She was scanning the room, assessing the players, calculating her next move in a game she was determined not to lose again. It was then that she heard it. A voice, low and resonant, cutting through the saccharine strains of the string quartet. It was a voice accustomed to command, laced with the casual arrogance of a man who had never once in his life been told no. "Look at them," the voice murmured, thick with disdain. "Circling like vultures. You can almost smell the scent of the counting house clinging to their silks." Annalise froze, her hand hovering over a flute of champagne. The words were not meant for her, not directly, but they landed like stones. She risked a glance from behind the fronds of a potted fern. The speaker was Alaric Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood. He stood with his back partially to her, a formidable silhouette in immaculate black wool. Power radiated from him, a cold, oppressive gravity that bent the room around his presence. He was the apex predator in this gilded jungle, and he was looking directly toward the corner where she had been standing only moments before. His companion, a lesser lord she vaguely recognized, chuckled obsequiously. "Everton's cast off. The Thorne girl. They say she can calculate a dowry to the last farthing faster than her father could ship wool." The Duke's laugh was not a sound of mirth. It was a short, sharp bark of contempt. "A merchant's daughter is a merchant's daughter. You can dress her in satin and parade her in a ballroom, but she remains a commodity. A poor investment, I'd wager. Liable to depreciate the moment you take her off the market." The world narrowed to the space between heartbeats. A poor investment. Commodity. The words were not just insults, they were a clinical, brutal dismissal of her entire being. He had taken her, her father's legacy, her quiet ambitions, and reduced them to a line item in a ledger of social worthlessness. The wound from Everton's betrayal had been a clean cut. This was a slow, grinding poison. For a moment, the heat of pure, unadulterated fury threatened to swamp her. She felt the tremor in her hands, the urge to march over there and slap the cold, aristocratic perfection from his face. She imagined the satisfying crack of her palm against his cheek, the shock in his cool gray eyes. But Annalise was not a creature of impulse. Rage was an expenditure of energy, and she managed her energy as carefully as she managed her accounts. She did not spill it wastefully. She channeled it. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her hand from the champagne flute. She straightened her spine until it felt like a rod of iron. The initial shock receded, replaced by a chilling, crystalline clarity. A cold resolve settled in her bones, solid and heavy. He thought her a commodity. A poor investment. Very well. He had just set his own valuation. It was time for an acquisition. She took a single, deep breath, composing her features into a mask of polite indifference. Then, she stepped out from behind the fern. She did not scurry away. She did not cast her eyes down. She walked, her posture perfect, her steps measured, directly into the Duke of Blackwood's path as he turned from his conversation. He stopped, surprised by her sudden appearance. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, swept over her. There was a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps annoyance at being interrupted. He was even more imposing up close, a man carved from granite and disdain. The scent of expensive bergamot cologne and something colder, like wet stone, clung to him. Anneliese met his gaze without flinching. Her own eyes, a warm hazel, felt like chips of ice. She held his stare for a single, charged second. Then, she dipped into a curtsy. It was not a small, deferential bob. It was a deep, deliberate, impeccably executed reverence, the kind one would offer to a king. It was so perfectly formal, so exaggerated in its respect, that it bordered on mockery. It said, "I heard you. I see you. And you are nothing to me." She rose, the ghost of a smile touching her lips, a smile that did not reach her eyes. Without a word, she turned and walked away, her sapphire gown whispering over the polished floor. She could feel his gaze on her back, a tangible pressure. She did not look back. She made her way through the glittering crowd, her head held high, and did not stop until she was in her carriage, the cool night air a balm on her heated skin. The rage was gone, burned away and forged into something harder, sharper, and infinitely more useful. Purpose. The Duke of Blackwood had declared her worthless. She would show him, with the brutal, undeniable logic of finance, exactly what she was worth. She would make him bankrupt in every way a man could be, or she would own him. The next morning, Anneliese did not weep or rage. She went to work. Her father's study, which she had maintained exactly as he had left it, was her sanctuary and her arsenal. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and the faint, comforting aroma of stale pipe tobacco trapped in the heavy velvet curtains. Here, she was not a commodity. She was in command. For years, her father had been more than just a merchant. He had been a silent force in the world of high finance, a lender to those whose pedigrees far outstripped their purses. He had been discreet, reliable, and had kept meticulous records. Anneliese had been his apprentice since she was old enough to hold a pen. She knew these ledgers as well as she knew her own name. Her target was clear, the Duke of Blackwood. His family was ancient, his title among the most respected in the kingdom. But Anneliese knew that ancient titles were often just another term for ancient debts. She pulled a heavy, leather-bound volume from a locked cabinet. The spine was unmarked. Discretion had been her father's watchword. Her slender fingers, unadorned by jewels, traced the index. Beaumont, Alaric. Duke of Blackwood. The entry was substantial. She flipped to the designated page, her heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. It was worse than she had imagined. It was a masterpiece of financial ruin. Mortgages on 3 of his 5 estates. A massive, unsecured loan for his grandfather's disastrous foray into shipping. Another to cover his father's gambling debts. The interest, compounding year after year, had grown into a monster. And her father, through a series of quiet acquisitions, had bought up every last shilling of that debt. Anneliese sat back in the worn leather chair, the book open on the desk before her. The numbers seemed to glow on the page. She was not merely a creditor. She was the creditor. The Duke of Blackwood, the man who had dismissed her as a poor investment, was, for all practical purposes, hers. A wave of dizzying power washed over her. She could ruin him. With a stroke of her pen, she could call in the loans, foreclose on his ancestral lands, and strip him of everything but his title. She could leave him a hollowed-out shell, a duke in name only, a living testament to the power of the counting house he so despised. The thought was tempting, a dark, sweet poison. But ruin was messy. It was loud. And it would not give her what she truly wanted. Revenge was a dish best served cold, but security was a feast that could last a lifetime. She needed to secure her position in a world that saw her as an intruder. Ruining a duke would make her a pariah. Marrying one, however. A new plan began to form, cold and audacious. It was a business merger. An acquisition, not of his assets, but of his name. Her fortune for his title. Her acumen for his security. It was a transaction, pure and simple. The kind of deal he would understand, even as he loathed it. She spent the rest of the day preparing her case. She drew up summaries, cross-referenced deeds, and compiled a portfolio that laid out his financial collapse in inescapable detail. She was building a fortress of facts, a siege engine of arithmetic. By evening, her plan was no longer a nascent idea, it was a weapon, polished and ready. The next day, she dispatched a note to Blackwood Manor. It was brief and formal, requesting a meeting on a matter of urgent financial importance. She did not mention her name, only the name of the legal firm that had managed her father's lending business. Let him wonder. Let him worry. 2 days later, she was shown into the Duke's study at Blackwood Manor. The house was a physical manifestation of his predicament. It was magnificent in its bones, soaring ceilings, dark, carved wood paneling, windows that looked out over 1,000 acres of rolling parkland. But a chill clung to the air that had nothing to do with the weather. The scent of damp and decay mingled with the faint, desperate aroma of lemon wax used to disguise it. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of afternoon light, illuminating the worn patches on the priceless Aubusson carpet. The house was dying. The Duke stood by the massive stone fireplace, where a pitifully small fire struggled against the gloom. He had not yet turned to face her. He was staring into the flames, one hand resting on the mantelpiece. Even from behind, he was an intimidating figure. "You requested this meeting," he said, his voice as cold as the room. "My men said it was urgent. I trust you will not waste my time." "I have no intention of wasting anyone's time, Your Grace." At the sound of her voice, he went rigid. Slowly, he turned. His gray eyes widened for a fraction of a second, the only sign of his shock. It was quickly replaced by a mask of cold fury. The sight of her, in his private study, was clearly an offense of the highest order. "You," he bit out, the single word dripping with contempt. "What is the meaning of this charade?" Anneliese did not flinch. She walked calmly to the massive mahogany desk that dominated the room and placed her leather portfolio upon its polished surface. "There is no charade, Your Grace. I am here representing the estate of my late father, which holds the entirety of your family's outstanding debt." He stared at her, his jaw tight. A muscle worked in his cheek. "That's impossible. My family's affairs are handled through a dozen different houses." She corrected softly. "My father was a very patient man. And a very thorough collector. It is all in here." She tapped the portfolio. "Every loan, every mortgage, every ill-advised investment dating back to your great-grandfather. The total principal, plus accrued interest." He stalked toward the desk, his movements tight with controlled rage. He looked less like a duke and more like a caged wolf. He flipped open the portfolio. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. The color drained from his face, leaving his aristocratic features stark and pale. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the frantic ticking of a tall case clock in the corner and the hiss of the dying fire. "You're lying," he whispered, but the words had no conviction. The proof was right in front of him, written in the unforgiving ink of his own family's folly. "The numbers do not lie, Your Grace," Anneliese said, her voice even. "You are on the verge of total ruin. The Blackwood title will soon be nothing more than an empty name attached to a man with no home and no funds. A poor investment." She let her own words hang in the air, a deliberate echo of his. His head snapped up, his eyes blazing with a mixture of hatred and humiliation. "What do you want? Blood? Do you intend to see me thrown into the street?" "Ruin is so inefficient," she said, tilting her head. "And frankly, not very profitable. I have a different proposal. A business arrangement." He let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "A business arrangement?" "Precisely." She folded her hands before her, the very picture of calm reason. "You require a massive infusion of capital to save your estate and your name. I require something that my fortune, vast as it is, cannot purchase: unimpeachable social standing. Security. A title." He stared at her, the dawning horror on his face a sight to behold. "You cannot be serious." "I am perfectly serious," she stated. "I propose a marriage. My dowry will be the complete and immediate cancellation of your entire debt. I will personally oversee the restoration of the Blackwood estates to profitability. In return, I will become the Duchess of Blackwood. It is a simple, clean transaction. Your name for my money. Your protection for my solvency." He looked as if she had physically struck him. The idea was so audacious, so far beyond the pale of his world, that he seemed unable to process it. He, Alaric Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, to be bought and sold like a prize bull at a country fair by a merchant's daughter he had insulted just days before. Never, he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. I would rather see this house crumble to dust around me. You are welcome to that choice, Annalise said, her calm unwavering. But it will not just be you. It will be your tenants, your staff, the generations of people whose livelihoods depend on this estate. Their ruin will also be on your ledger. Or, you can accept my terms. A cold, practical contract. No pretense of affection. We would be partners in a business, nothing more. You would be free to live your life as you see fit, as would I. But your legacy would be saved. And I, she added softly, would be safe. She watched the war play out on his face. The battle between his immense, suffocating pride and the crushing reality of his circumstances. He paced the length of the room, his fists clenched at his sides. The ticking clock seemed to grow louder, marking the seconds of his gilded cage shrinking around him. He was trapped. He knew it. She knew it. Finally, he stopped, his back to her once more. He stared out the tall, grimy window at the neglected gardens. There will be terms, he said, his voice ragged. Conditions. Annalise allowed herself a small, internal sigh of victory. The siege was over. The fortress had fallen. I am, of course, open to negotiation. Separate wings of the house. Separate lives. In public, we will present a united front. In private, we are strangers. That seems a perfectly sensible arrangement, she agreed. He turned, and the look in his eyes was one of pure, undiluted loathing. It was a look that promised a cold and bitter life. Fine, he spat, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. You will have your title. I hope you choke on it. Annalise merely inclined her head. A pleasure doing business with you, Your Grace. The marriage was a swift, sterile affair conducted in a dusty London chapel with only 2 lawyers as witnesses. The ink on the marriage contract was barely dry before the ink on the documents cancelling his debt was applied. Annalise Thorne was now the Duchess of Blackwood. The title felt alien, a heavy cloak she had not yet grown into. Her arrival at Blackwood Manor as its new mistress was met with a silence as thick and unwelcoming as the winter fog. The staff, loyal to the Duke and his ancient line, looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and resentment. She was the interloper, the tradesman's daughter who had bought her way into their world. Alaric, her new husband, escorted her to the threshold and no further. The East Wing has been prepared for you, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Your chambers are there. The West Wing is mine. I trust you will find your new accommodations adequate. He turned and walked away without another word, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous, cold hall. Annalise was left standing with her modest luggage, the new duchess in a house that was not a home, bound to a man who despised her. The air was heavy with the smell of damp stone and the ghosts of 1,000 resentments. For a moment, standing alone in the grand, decaying entrance hall, a flicker of doubt assailed her. Had she overplayed her hand? Had she traded one form of social precarity for a gilded cage, trapped with a man whose cold fury was a constant, simmering threat? She pushed the thought away. This was not a fairy tale. This was a balance sheet. She had made a calculated risk for a significant return. Now, it was time to manage her new asset. Her first order of business was not the staff or the decor, but the books. She requested the household ledgers, and the steward, a florid man named Mr. Hemlock, presented them with a condescending sniff. He clearly expected her to glance at them and hand them back, a woman playing at business. He did not know Annalise. She took the heavy volumes to her new rooms in the East Wing. The chambers were vast and cold, furnished with beautiful but threadbare antiques. A fire had been lit in the hearth, but it did little to chase the oppressive chill. She ignored her surroundings. She sat at a delicate, spindly-legged desk, opened the first ledger, and began her true work. The state of the household accounts was appalling. It was a symphony of waste, graft, and breathtaking incompetence. Tradesmen were overcharging by double, sometimes triple. The wine cellar was being systematically pilfered. The steward was paying wages to 3 grooms who, Annalise suspected, existed only on paper. It was not just a dying house, it was being actively bled dry from the inside. A slow, cold anger began to build in her. This was not just poor management, it was a betrayal of the Duke, of the estate itself. These people, who so prided themselves on their loyalty to his ancient name, were the very ones hastening its demise. For the next week, Anneliese worked relentlessly. She rose before dawn and worked late into the night, fueled by black tea and a stubborn, burning drive. She cross-referenced every invoice with her own knowledge of market rates. She demanded inventories of the larders, the cellars, the linen closets. She walked the grounds, her sensible boots crunching on the gravel paths, her sharp eyes missing nothing, the broken slate on a stable roof, the rot in a fence post, the overgrown kitchen garden. Her activities did not go unnoticed. The staff whispered. Mr. Hemlock grew increasingly agitated, his condescension curdling into outright hostility. The Duke remained entirely absent, a ghost in the opposite wing of the house. They saw each other only at dinner, a silent, miserable affair at opposite ends of a ridiculously long dining table. They exchanged no more than the barest civilities, two strangers bound by a contract of mutual convenience and dislike. After a week of investigation, Anneliese was ready. She summoned Mr. Hemlock to the morning room, a once beautiful space now shrouded in dust covers. She had her ledgers spread across a table. Mr. Hemlock, she began without preamble, I have been reviewing the household accounts. Indeed, Your Grace, he said, a smug smile playing on his lips. A complex matter, I am sure. If you have any simple questions, I would be happy to assist. Anneliese looked up at him, her gaze flat and direct. My questions are not simple. For instance, I am curious as to why we are paying the butcher a price for beef that is 50% above the highest rates in London. I am also curious about the employment of 3 grooms, a John Smith, a Thomas Jones, and a William Brown, for whom no one on the staff can account. The color drained from Hemlock's face. His smugness vanished, replaced by a panicked sweat. A misunderstanding, Your Grace. Clerical errors. There are hundreds of such clerical errors, Anneliese cut in, her voice like ice. Amounting to thousands of pounds a year. It is not an error, Mr. Hemlock. It is theft. You are dismissed. You will be out of this house by noon. Be grateful I do not have you thrown in jail. He stared at her, sputtering, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. That she, this upstart, would dare to challenge him. He opened his mouth to protest, to appeal to the Duke, but one look at the cold, unyielding certainty in her eyes, and he deflated. He knew he was beaten. He turned and fled. Anneliese took no satisfaction in his dismissal. It was simply a necessary correction on a faulty balance sheet. She spent the rest of the day interviewing the remaining staff, one by one. She was not unkind, but she was direct. She made it clear that the old ways were over. Efficiency, honesty, and hard work would be rewarded. Laziness and theft would not be tolerated. To her surprise, among the younger staff, the maids and footmen who had been bullied by Hemlock, she found not resentment, but relief. That evening, for the first time, the fire in the great hall was roaring, its warmth pushing back the perpetual chill. The scent of beeswax replaced the smell of dust. The meal, while simple, was perfectly cooked and served on polished silver. Alaric entered the dining room and stopped. He looked around, a flicker of surprise in his cold eyes. He noticed the fire, the clean scent in the air. He looked at her, seated at the far end of the table, her expression unreadable. He said nothing, but as he took his seat, his customary scowl seemed a fraction less severe. He had been aware of her activities, of course. The whispers from the staff had reached his study. He had expected a rebellion, a mass exodus of servants loyal to the old ways. He had expected her to fail, to come to him defeated, proving his initial assessment of her correct. Instead, there was this. Order. Warmth. The quiet hum of a household beginning to run properly for the first time in decades. A few days later, he was in his study, wrestling with the estate ledgers. They were a tangled mess his father and grandfather had left him, a testament to aristocratic incompetence. He had been trying for years to make sense of them, to find a path out of the woods, but it was like trying to navigate a swamp in the dark. He heard a soft knock at the door. Enter, he called, his voice sharp with irritation. It was Anneliese. She stood in the doorway, holding a slim ledger. She did not look at him, but at the chaos of papers on his desk. "I have finished my preliminary review of the household expenditures," she said, her voice cool and professional. "I have identified redundancies and sources of waste. I have also prepared a proposed budget for the next quarter. I thought you might wish to see it." He grunted, expecting a piece of amateurish nonsense. Reluctantly, he gestured for her to approach. She placed the ledger on his desk, well within his personal space. For a moment, her scent, something clean and subtle, like lavender and paper, cut through the stale air of the room. It was not unpleasant. He opened the book. He had expected flowery, feminine script. Instead, the handwriting was clean, sharp, and ruthlessly efficient. The columns were perfect. The logic was undeniable. She had consolidated suppliers, eliminated fraudulent accounts, and reallocated funds with a brilliance that was almost terrifying. In 1 week, she had understood the intricate workings of his household better than he had in 5 years. She hadn't just trimmed the fat, she had performed life-saving surgery on the budget. He looked up from the ledger, truly looked at her for the first time since their disastrous meeting. She was not the grasping social climber he had painted her as. She was not a commodity. She was a general, surveying her field of battle. There was an intelligence in her hazel eyes, a quiet competence in the set of her jaw, that he had been utterly blind to. A grudging, unfamiliar feeling began to stir within him. It felt like respect. "This," he started, his voice rough. He cleared his throat. "This is comprehensive," it was the closest he could come to a compliment. "It is a start," she replied, her expression unchanging. "The house is only the smallest part of the problem. The real losses are on the tenant farms and the quarry." She turned to leave. He found himself watching her go, the straightness of her back, the determined set of her shoulders. The woman he had married out of desperation, the woman he had intended to ignore, was proving to be something entirely unexpected. She was not just saving his house. She was a force of nature in her own right. The thought was deeply unsettling. And, to his immense annoyance, intriguing. The nightly dinners remained a bastion of silence, but the quality of that silence began to change. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of mutual hatred. It became a lighter, more contemplative quiet. Anneliese would sometimes bring a small ledger to the table, making notes between courses. Alaric would find himself watching her, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the swift, decisive movements of her pen. One evening, a storm was raging outside, throwing sheets of rain against the tall windows of the dining room. The fire crackled, a lone bastion of warmth and light against the tumultuous dark. They had finished their meal. A footman had placed a decanter of brandy and 2 glasses on a small table near the hearth, a hopeful gesture that had, until now, gone ignored. Anneliese was staring into the flames, her usual composure softened by the flickering light. Alaric, against his better judgment, found himself walking not to the door that led to his wing, but toward the fireplace. He poured 2 glasses of brandy, the amber liquid catching the light. He held one out to her. She looked up, startled, her eyes wide in the firelight. She hesitated for a moment, then took the glass. Her fingers brushed his as she took it, a brief, accidental touch of cool, soft skin against his own. He felt an unexpected jolt, a spark of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the brandy. He quickly withdrew his hand. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. He merely nodded, taking a seat in the large wingback chair opposite hers. For several long minutes, they drank in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the howling wind. It was the closest they had been physically since their wedding day. He could see the fine, dark lashes that framed her intelligent eyes, the determined line of her mouth, now softened in repose. "Hemlock was a fool," he said abruptly, the words escaping before he could stop them. Anneliese looked at him over the rim of her glass. A faint, wry smile touched her lips. "He was a thief. There is a difference. A fool merely loses money. A thief steals it." Alaric considered this. "A fine distinction." "It is the most important distinction," she replied. "One is a matter of competence, the other of character." He found himself smiling, a genuine, unforced smile. It felt foreign on his face. "You sound like a general discussing her officers." "An estate is not so different from an army," she said, her gaze returning to the fire. It requires strategy, discipline, and a clear understanding of who is loyal and who is not. The conversation lapsed back into silence, but this time it was comfortable, companionable. They were no longer two enemies at opposite ends of a battlefield, but two strategists sharing a moment of quiet truce before a fire. A crack had appeared in the armor he wore so carefully. For the first time, he did not feel as though he were in the room with his jailer, but with an ally. A very capable, very surprising ally. The fragile truce forged by the fireside was shattered a week later. A letter arrived, bearing the seal of a prominent London banker, Sir Hugo Cavendish. It was a formal, merciless notice. A substantial loan, secured against the estate's most profitable tenant farm, was being called in. Payment in full was due in 30 days, or foreclosure proceedings would begin. Alaric read the letter twice, the words blurring before his eyes. This was a debt he thought he had another year to service. Cavendish had been an old friend of his father's. This was not just a business move, it was a betrayal. It was a death blow. Annalise's dowry had settled the debts her father held, but it had not touched the ones owed to others. It had been a staggering sum, but not an infinite one. There was simply not enough liquid capital left to cover this. He sat in his study, the letter clutched in his hand, the walls of the room closing in on him. This was it. The final failure. He had sold his name, his very self, to save his legacy, and it was still not enough. The House of Beaumont, which had weathered wars and plagues and the folly of kings, would be brought down by a banker's pen. He felt a hollowness spread through his chest, a cold, crushing despair that was worse than any anger. The pride that had been his shield and his curse crumbled, leaving him exposed and raw. For the first time in his life, Alaric Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood, felt utterly, hopelessly defeated. He didn't hear the door open. He only registered Annalise's presence when she spoke, her voice soft but clear. The post arrived. I saw the seal from Cavendish. He didn't look up. He couldn't. He simply held out the crumpled letter, an offering of his own failure. He expected her to take it with a cool, "I told you so." He expected her to remind him of the precariousness of his position, a position he had tried so hard to pretend was secure. She took the letter. He heard the rustle of paper as she read it. The silence stretched, thick with his shame. 30 days, she said finally. Her voice was not triumphant, nor was it pitying. It was factual. Analytical. He finally forced himself to look at her. He expected to see contempt in her eyes. Instead, he saw concentration. She was not looking at him as a failed duke, but at the letter as a problem to be solved. I sold my name for nothing, he said, the words tasting like poison. The confession was torn from him, a raw admission of the immense burden he carried. I sacrificed everything to preserve this legacy, and it's all turning to dust. This is the end. Annalise placed the letter on the desk. She looked at him, her hazel eyes clear and steady. Despair is a liability we cannot afford, Your Grace. This is not the end. It is a complication. She walked over to a large, rolled map of the estate that lay on a side table. She unfurled it, weighting the corners with books. The map was old, the parchment cracked. It depicted the thousands of acres of Blackwood land. The solution is not in London, she said, her finger tracing a line across the faded drawing. It's here. We don't have the capital to pay Cavendish, so we must generate it. Generate it, he scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping him. From what? The farms are barely breaking even. The timber is worth a fraction of what we need. Her finger stopped on a remote, hilly section of the estate in the north. Here, she said. Your great-grandfather's folly. The old granite quarry. Alaric stared at the map. The quarry? It hasn't been worked in a century. It's flooded. The equipment is rusted to nothing. Granite is in high demand for the new government buildings in the city, she said, her voice quickening with energy. It was the most animated he had ever seen her. They are paying a premium. I read it in the financial papers last week. If the stone is of high quality, and if we can secure a contract quickly, we can get an advance. Enough to satisfy Cavendish and buy us time. The idea was so audacious, so practical. It was a solution born not of aristocratic maneuvering but of pure commercial logic. It was a solution he, with all his history and breeding, had never once considered. He had seen the quarry only as a scar on the landscape, a monument to a past failure. She saw it as an asset waiting to be liquidated. We would need to survey it, he said, the first spark of hope igniting in the cold darkness of his despair. To assess the quality of the stone. Exactly, she said, turning to face him. And we need to do it now. We don't have time to waste. For the first time, she was not his adversary or his warden. She was his ally. She was offering not condemnation, but a strategy. A lifeline. The next morning, they rode out together towards the old quarry. The weather had turned, a brooding gray sky threatening rain. They rode in silence, but it was the silence of shared purpose. Anneliese, dressed in a practical dark wool riding habit, looked completely at home on horseback. She rode with a straight-backed confidence that he was beginning to realize was central to her character. The path to the quarry was overgrown, long neglected. They had to dismount and lead their horses through thickets of thorn and bramble. The threatened rain began to fall, a cold, persistent drizzle that soaked through their coats and turned the path to mud. They were forcing their way through a dense copse of ancient oaks when a sudden, violent gust of wind tore through the trees. There was a sickening crack, a groan of tortured wood, and an immense, half-rotted oak branch, thick as a man's waist, crashed down across the path just ahead of them, blocking their way completely. Their horses shied, rearing in terror. Alaric grabbed the reins of Anneliese's frightened mare, his other hand steadying his own mount. "Easy," he soothed, his voice low and calm. The path was impassable. The branch was a solid wall of splintered wood. They were miles from the manor, the rain was turning into a downpour, and evening was not far off. "We'll have to go back," Alaric said, shouting over the wind. "No." Anneliese shouted back, her face set with grim determination. "We don't have time. We have to get to that quarry today." She looked at the massive branch, then at him. There was no fear in her eyes, only resolve. In that moment, stripped of their titles and their resentments by the raw power of the storm, they were just a man and a woman facing an obstacle. "We move it," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He stared at her, then at the branch. It was madness. But looking at the fierce resolve on her face, he found himself nodding. "All right," he yelled. Together. They tethered the horses securely. The next hour was a blur of brutal, physical labor. They were soaked to the skin within minutes. The rain plastered her dark hair to her face and dripped from the end of her nose. His fine wool coat was ruined, smeared with mud and moss. They strained against the immense weight of the branch, their boots slipping in the mud. He used his shoulder as a lever, she found purchase and pushed with all her might, her jaw clenched. It was grueling, punishing work. Splinters tore at their hands. Muscles screamed in protest. But they did not stop. They worked together, a silent, synchronized team. He would find a new angle, and she would immediately adjust, adding her strength to his. The artifice of their lives, the ducal title, the merchant's fortune, the cold contract that bound them, was stripped away by the mud and the rain and the sheer physical effort. Finally, with one last, desperate, coordinated heave, the branch shifted. It scraped over the muddy ground, moving just enough to clear a narrow path. They collapsed against a tree trunk, gasping for breath, their chests heaving. Rainwater streamed down their faces. Anneliese pushed a stray, wet strand of hair from her eyes, leaving a streak of mud on her cheek. Alaric looked at her. Her elegant riding habit was a mess. Her hands were raw. She looked utterly exhausted. And he had never seen her look more magnificent. A laugh, a real, genuine laugh, bubbled up from his chest. It was a laugh of exhaustion, of relief, of sheer, incredulous admiration. She looked at him, startled, and then a slow smile spread across her own mud-streaked face. "What's so funny?" she asked, her breath coming in ragged pants. "Us," he said, gesturing between them. "The Duke and Duchess of Blackwood. Defeated by a tree branch." "We were not defeated," she corrected, her smile widening. "We moved it." They reached the quarry just as the last of the daylight was fading. It was a vast, water-filled bowl carved out of the hillside, stark and beautiful in the gray twilight. Alaric, using a geologist's hammer he had brought, chipped away samples of the exposed rock face. The granite was a deep, consistent gray, shot through with shimmering flecks of quartz. It was even better than they had hoped. The ride back was slow, their horses tired, their bodies aching. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and pine. As they neared the manor, the first lights were appearing in the windows, yellow squares of warmth in the deepening dusk. It looked, for the first time, like a home. Back in the warmth of the great hall, a footman rushed forward to take their wet things. Alaric saw Annalise shiver, her lips tinged with blue from the cold. He saw the raw, red skin of her hands. As she turned to head toward her wing of the house, he spoke. Annalise. It was the first time he had used her given name. She stopped and looked back at him, her expression questioning. In the library, he said, his voice rough. I'll have them bring hot brandy. We have a contract to draft. Later, sitting by the library fire, wrapped in dry dressing gowns, the warmth of the brandy spreading through them, they worked. He dictated the technical specifications of the stone, she drafted the terms of the proposal, her financial language sharp and precise. As she was writing, he noticed her wince as she gripped the pen. He looked down and saw a dark, angry-looking splinter embedded in the palm of her right hand, a casualty of their battle with the branch. Without thinking, he reached out and took her hand. It was small and surprisingly soft, despite the new rawness. She tensed, startled by the contact, but did not pull away. You're hurt, he said, his voice softer than he intended. His thumb brushed over her palm, his touch gentle. Her skin was cold, and the contrast with his own warmth was startling. He held her hand, turning it to the light. The splinter was deep. Stay here, he murmured. He went to a small cabinet and returned with a pair of fine tweezers and a bottle of antiseptic. He sat on the ottoman before her chair, her hand still resting in his. This may sting, he said quietly. He worked with a surgeon's care, his large, strong fingers surprisingly deft. He could feel the slight tremor in her hand, hear the soft intake of her breath. He focused on the task, on the small point of contact between them, the world narrowing to her skin, her warmth, the faint scent of rain that still clung to her hair. When he finally drew the splinter out, she let out a small, shaky sigh of relief. He carefully cleaned the small wound and looked up at her. Her eyes were fixed on his face, her expression unguarded and vulnerable. The carefully constructed walls between them had been washed away by the storm, leaving something new and fragile in their place. He was still holding her hand. He made no move to release it. She made no move to pull it away. The protective, functional touch had become something else entirely. It was a connection, a silent acknowledgement of the shift that had occurred between them. He was no longer just the Duke, and she was no longer just the merchant's daughter. They were Alaric and Annalise. And in the quiet warmth of the library, with the ghosts of their shared ordeal still clinging to them, that felt like everything. The Blackwood annual ball had, for generations, been the pinnacle of the local social season. This year, it was something more. It was a statement. The successful reopening of the quarry, and the massive contract Annalise had secured, had sent a shockwave through the county. The rumors of the Duke's ruin had been replaced by whispers of his astonishing, unexpected solvency. Blackwood was on the rise again, and the world was clamoring to witness it. For Annalise, the ball was a battlefield. It would be her first time hosting as Duchess, her first time standing beside Alaric not as a contractual partner but as a public power. The scrutiny would be intense. Her every move, every word, every nuance of her interaction with her husband would be dissected by 100 pairs of malicious eyes. She had commissioned a new gown for the occasion. It was not bought with Alaric's newfound income, but with the savings she had accrued from her own ruthlessly efficient management of the household. It was an investment in herself. The gown was the color of molten gold, a rich, heavy satin that shimmered under the candlelight. It was a declaration of wealth, yes, but of earned wealth. It was the color of profit. As she descended the grand staircase, the murmur of the crowd below hushed. Every head turned. Alaric was waiting at the bottom, dressed in formal black and white, the stark colors emphasizing his dark, imposing presence. He watched her descend, and for a moment, the cool, controlled mask slipped from his face. His gray eyes were wide with an emotion she couldn't quite name, a mixture of awe and something deeper, more possessive. He took her hand as she reached the last step. His grip was firm, his thumb stroking the back of her glove. Annalise, he murmured, his voice low and for her ears only. You are a formidable asset. She smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. High praise, coming from a man who once declared me a poor investment. A flicker of his old arrogance, now tempered with humor, returned. My calculations were flawed. I have since revised my portfolio. They entered the ballroom together, a united front. The sheer, undeniable power of their presence silenced the whispers before they could even begin. He was the ancient, revitalized title, she was the brilliant, modern mind that had saved it. Together, they were unassailable. Or so she thought. Later in the evening, as Alaric was occupied with a group of powerful landowners, Annalise stepped onto a small, secluded balcony for a breath of cool night air. The music and chatter of the ballroom faded to a pleasant murmur. Well, well. Look what we have here. The little mouse, pretending to be a duchess. Annalise stiffened. The voice was honey-sweet and venomous. She turned. Lady Beatrice Croft, the woman for whom Lord Everton had jilted her, stood in the doorway to the balcony. She was flanked by her gaggle of sycophantic friends. Beatrice, beautiful and vapid, looked Annalise up and down, her lip curled in a sneer. That is a lovely gown, Beatrice said, her voice dripping with false admiration. Did you sew it yourself? I hear you are very practical. Annalise refused to rise to the bait. Lady Beatrice, she said, her tone level. Are you enjoying the ball? Beatrice laughed, a high, brittle sound. Oh, immensely. It's so amusing to see the old house with a bit of new paint. It almost hides the smell of trade. She took a step closer, her eyes glittering with malice. With her was Lord Everton himself, looking weak and uncomfortable, a pathetic shadow of the men she once thought she loved. He couldn't meet her eyes. And then it happened. Another of the ladies, a sly-faced baroness, stumbled forward with a cry of feigned surprise. In her hand was a full glass of deep red wine. It arced through the air, a perfect, ruby-red slash of deliberate ruin. The wine splashed across the front of Annalise's golden gown, a shocking, ugly stain that spread like a mortal wound. There was a collective gasp from the women. Oh, my dear Duchess, the Baroness cried, her face a mask of false horror. How clumsy of me. Your beautiful dress, it's utterly ruined. Beatrice smiled, a thin, triumphant smirk. The attack was complete. They had not physically torn her gown, but they had done the modern, socially acceptable equivalent. They had marked her, stained her, tried to remind her in the most public way possible that she did not belong. For a heart-stopping moment, the old Annalise, the wounded, humiliated girl from the Marquis's gala, surfaced. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes. The shame was a hot, physical thing. The golden gown, her symbol of triumph, was destroyed. But then the new Annalise, the Duchess of Blackwood, the woman who had faced down ruin and moved mountains, took control. She drew in a sharp breath, her spine straightening. She looked down at the hideous stain, then back up at the smirking faces of her tormentors. She did not weep. She did not rage. She simply stared at them with a cold, quiet contempt that was far more unnerving than any outburst. The moment stretched, thick and silent. And then, a new presence filled the doorway. Is there a problem here? It was Alaric. His voice was not loud, but it had a lethal calm that sliced through the tension. The entire ballroom behind him seemed to have gone silent, every guest straining to see the drama unfolding on the balcony. His eyes took in the scene in an instant, Annalise's ruined gown, the spilled wine, the triumphant look on Beatrice's face, the guilty panic on the Baroness's. His face became a mask of cold, controlled fury. It was an accident, Your Grace, Beatrice simpered, stepping forward. Baroness Finch is ever so clumsy. Alaric's gaze shifted to the Baroness, and the woman physically flinched, her face going pale. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Baroness Finch, he said, his voice soft and deadly. My wife, the Duchess, has spent the last 6 months reviewing the accounts of every tenant and supplier on the Blackwood estate. She has an extraordinary memory for numbers. For instance, she happened to mention to me just last week that your husband, the Baron, is 3 years in arrears on his lease for the Millwater farm. A lease I believe is up for renewal next month. The Baroness looked as if he had struck her. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Alaric's gaze then moved to Beatrice. And you, Lady Beatrice. Your father was a vocal opponent of the Quarry Project. He called it a fool's errand. I wonder how he will feel when the new Blackwood-funded road to the capital bypasses his lands entirely, effectively cutting him off from the main trade route. He paused, letting the implication sink in. A poor investment, I believe the term is. He was using his power, their combined power, as a weapon. And it was devastating. He stepped forward, moving to Annalise's side. He looked from the ruined women to Annalise, his expression softening. Then he looked at the stain on her gown. These women, he said, his voice now ringing with a clear, carrying authority that reached the listening crowd in the ballroom, have offered you an insult. They have done so because they are small and petty, and they are terrified. They look at you, and they see everything they are not: intelligent, capable, strong. They see a woman whose mind is a far greater asset than any empty title or parcel of land. He held the gaze of every person watching. They have attempted to ruin a gown. They fail to understand that the Duchess of Blackwood's worth is not in the fabric she wears. Her worth is in her character. Her worth is in her resilience. Her worth, he said, his voice dropping slightly as his eyes met hers, is immeasurable. Then he did something that stunned the entire room into absolute silence. He began to shrug off his own formal ducal coat. With a smooth, deliberate motion, he draped the heavy, exquisitely tailored black wool coat over Annalise's shoulders, completely covering the wine-stained gown. It was an act of profound, public chivalry. It was a king covering his queen. He was wrapping her in his name, his protection, his absolute and unwavering support. He placed a hand on the small of her back. "My dear," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I believe these people are no longer welcome in our home." Effective immediately. He turned his back on the humiliated, socially annihilated women. Lady Beatrice's face was a mask of utter ruin. Baroness Finch looked as though she might faint. Lord Everton had simply vanished. With his arm securely around her, Alaric guided Annalise from the balcony, through the parted, silent sea of their guests, and toward the grand staircase. The whispers were silenced. The gossip was dead. The message was unequivocal. The Duke and Duchess of Blackwood were one. To insult her was to declare war on him. They were a fortress. And its walls were impregnable. They ascended the grand staircase, leaving the stunned silence of the ballroom behind them. The heavy ducal coat was a warm, comforting weight on Annalise's shoulders, smelling of him, of bergamot, wool, and righteous anger. The silence between them as they walked the long, carpeted corridor to the east wing was no longer tense or awkward. It was charged with unspoken emotions, a current of energy that crackled in the air. He walked her to the door of her chambers. The suite that had once been her gilded prison now felt like a sanctuary. He stopped, turning to face her under the soft glow of a wall sconce. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving them both emotionally exhausted but inextricably bound together. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low, his gray eyes searching her face. She nodded, clutching the lapels of his coat. "Thank you," she whispered. It felt like an inadequate word for what he had done. He hadn't just defended her, he had vindicated her. He had used his power not to crush her, as she had once feared, but to lift her up. He reached up, his hand gentle, and brushed a stray curl from her temple. His fingers lingered for a moment against her skin. "They are fools. I will not have you treated with anything less than the respect you are owed." He then looked down at the heavy coat still draped around her. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached for the collar. "Let me help you with this." He carefully slid the coat from her shoulders. The act felt symbolic, as if he were removing the heavy mantle of his public role, shedding the armor he had just worn for her. He tossed it onto a nearby chair. His gaze fell to the diamond and sapphire necklace at her throat, the famous Blackwood sapphires, a heavy, ostentatious piece that had been part of the Duchess's regalia for centuries. It had felt like a beautiful yoke all evening. "And this," he murmured, his voice husky. He stepped closer, his hands moving to the back of her neck. His fingers were warm against her skin as he fumbled with the intricate clasp. The gesture was incredibly intimate, far more so than their shared ordeal in the storm. Here, in the quiet of her private space, it was an act of gentle, personal care. She stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel his breath on her hair, smell the clean scent of his skin. The air between them was thick with everything they had not said, every resentment that had melted away, every spark of respect that had grown into a flame. The heavy necklace came free. He held it for a moment, then placed it on a table, the jewels clattering softly against the wood. Another piece of the public facade, removed. He did not step back. He stood before her, his eyes dark and intense. "Annalise," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "That first night, at the Pembroke ball." "What I said," he shook his head, a look of profound self-disgust on his face. "There is no excuse. But I need you to know the reason." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I was drowning. The weight of my father's failures, my grandfather's, it was crushing me. I looked at you, and I saw competence. Confidence. You represented a world of commerce and capital that was swallowing mine whole. And I was terrified. And I was jealous." The confession was raw, stripped of all his ducal pride. "What I said about you, it was not about you at all. It was about my own failure. My own fear. I am sorry." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of humiliation. They were tears of a deep, profound emotional release. "And I," she confessed, her voice thick, "I married you for a title. For security. It was a transaction. A cold entry in a ledger." "And is that what it is now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She looked up at him, at the men who had stood as her champion, the men who had worked beside her in the mud, the men who had just laid his soul bare before her. "No," she whispered. "It is not." He raised a hand, his thumb gently wiping away a tear that had escaped and traced a path down her cheek. His touch was electric. He leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She did not. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. His lips met hers. It was not a kiss of duty or transaction. It was not the accidental brush of fingers or a fleeting moment of shared victory. This was a conscious choice. It was a confession in its own right. The kiss was not light or tentative. It was deep and sure, heavy with the weight of everything they had overcome. It was grounded and real, a passionate affirmation of their new truth. It was the first true kiss of their marriage, and it tasted of brandy, and rain, and the breathtaking, triumphant feeling of finally coming home. It was the sealing of a new contract, one not written in ink, but in the undeniable language of the heart. Her hand came up to cup his jaw, and she kissed him back with all the pent-up emotion of the past months, surrendering not to his title or his power, but to the man himself. The man who had become her partner in every sense of the word. 1 year later, sunlight streamed through the tall, immaculately clean windows of the Duke's, now their, study. The room was transformed. The oppressive chill was gone, replaced by a comfortable warmth from a brightly burning fire. The scent of damp and decay had been vanquished by the pleasant aromas of beeswax, fresh flowers, and brewing coffee. The worn patches on the carpet were gone, replaced by a new, richly colored rug Annalise had sourced at a remarkable price from a weaver in the city. It was spring. Outside, the once neglected gardens were a riot of color, meticulously tended. The sound of birdsong mingled with the distant, rhythmic clang of hammers from the estate's newly repaired stables. Blackwood Manor was no longer a ruin, it was a thriving, vibrant heart of a prosperous domain. Annalise sat at the large mahogany desk, but she was not alone. Alaric sat beside her, not at the opposite end of the room, but close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed. They were bent over the same ledger, the master accounts for the entire estate. "The return on the north pasture drainage is better than we projected," she murmured, tapping a figure with the end of her pen. "Your idea to use the stone from the quarry for the culverts saved us nearly 20% on transport. And your idea to sell the excess timber to the shipyards paid for the labor twice over," he countered, a warm smile in his voice. He leaned in, his arm brushing hers as he pointed to another column. "With the final payment from the government contract, Sir Hugo Cavendish's loan will be a memory. We will be entirely debt-free." Annalise leaned back in her chair, a deep sense of satisfaction settling over her. Debt-free. It was the most beautiful phrase in the language. They had done it. Together. Their marriage, born of a cold transaction, had become the most profitable and successful partnership of her life. Alaric watched her, his expression soft. The harsh lines of pride and worry that had once seemed carved into his face had smoothed away, replaced by a quiet contentment. He no longer looked like a burdened aristocrat, but simply a man happy in his own home. He reached over, not for the ledger, but for her hand. He lifted it to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles. "The greatest asset this estate has ever known," he said, his gray eyes full of a love and admiration that still made her heart skip a beat. She turned her hand in his, lacing their fingers together. "It has been a profitable venture for us both." He rose from his chair and came to stand behind her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on the top of her head, inhaling the scent of her hair. "I was thinking," he murmured into her ear, his voice a low rumble. "Now that the ledgers are balanced and the house is in order." "Yes," she prompted, tilting her head back to look up at him. "Perhaps it is time we considered a new investment. A joint venture. One that might require a nursery." Annalisa's breath caught. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. She twisted in her chair to face him fully, her hands coming up to frame his face. The man who had once been her enemy, her jailer, her cold, reluctant partner, was now her husband in every sense of the word. Her partner, her ally, her love. "Your Grace," she whispered, her eyes shining. "I believe the projected returns on such an investment would be immeasurable." He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss not of fiery passion or desperate confession, but of quiet, enduring love. It was a kiss that spoke of shared futures, of a home built on a foundation not of stone or title, but of mutual respect, hard-won trust, and a partnership that had turned the cold, hard lines of a balance sheet into a love story for the ages. The House of Blackwood was solvent, yes, but more importantly, it was finally, truly, a home.